The story of Macbeth.
When Duncan the Meek reigned King of Scotland, there lived a great thane or lord called Macbeth. This Macbeth was a valiant soldier and much favoured for his victories in battle. After one such victory, Macbeth and another Scottish general, Banquo, were returning home, and their way lay over a blasted heath. Here they were stopped by three strange, witch-like women. The first of these saluted Macbeth with the title of Thane of Glamis. The general was greatly startled that such creatures should know him, and even more so when the second saluted him with the title of Thane of Cawdor, to which honour he had no pretensions. The third bid him, "All hail, King thou shalt be hereafter." Such a prophecy amazed him, for he knew he could not hope to succeed to the throne while a king's two sons lived. The witches then turned to Banquo and spoke to him in riddles, that he should be lesser than Macbeth and greater, not so happy but much happier. And finally they prophesied that though he should never reign, yet his sons after him should be kings in Scotland. The weird sisters then turned in the air and vanished.
While the general stood pondering on the strangeness of this adventure, there arrived certain messengers from the king, who conferred upon Macbeth the title of Thane of Cawdor, an event so miraculously corresponding with the prediction of the witches, it astonished Macbeth, and he stood wrapped in amazement. In that moment, swelling hopes arose in his mind that the prediction of the third witch might also be fulfilled, and that he should one day reign king in Scotland. The wicked suggestions of the witches had sunk so deep into the mind of Macbeth that from now on he bent all his thoughts on how to obtain the Scottish throne.
Macbeth had a wife, to whom he communicated the strange prediction of the weird sisters and its partial accomplishment. She was a bad, ambitious woman, and she determined that her husband and herself would arrive at greatness, and she cared not by what means. She spurred on the reluctant purpose of Macbeth, who shied away from actually shedding blood, and told him that the murder of the king was a step absolutely necessary to the fulfillment of the prophecy.
It happened at this time that the king, who out of his royal condescension would oftentimes visit his principal nobility, came to Macbeth's house, attended by his two sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, to honour Macbeth for the triumphal success of his wars. The castle of Macbeth was pleasantly situated, and the king entered well pleased with the place, and not less so with the attentions and respect of his honoured hostess, Lady Macbeth, who had the art of covering treacherous purposes with smiles, and could look like the innocent flower while she was indeed the serpent hiding underneath.
The king, being tired after his journey, went early to bed, and two grooms of his chamber slept beside him. Now was the middle of the night, and this was the time when Lady Macbeth waked to carry out the murder of the king. She would not have undertaken a deed so abhorrent to her sex, but that she feared her husband's nature was too full of the milk of human kindness to do a contrived murder himself, and although she had won his consent to do it, she doubted his resolution. So, armed with a dagger, she approached the king's bed, having taken care to ply the grooms of his chamber with so much wine they slept intoxicated, careless of their charge. Duncan lay asleep, and as she viewed him earnestly, there was something in his face which so resembled her own father, she had not the courage to proceed, and returned to confer with her husband.
Macbeth's resolution had now begun to waver. He considered that there were strong reasons against the deed. In the first place, he was not only a subject of this king, but his kinsman as well. He had been the king's host that day, whose duty it was to shut the door against his murderers, not bear the knife himself. Then he considered how just and merciful a king this Duncan had been, how clear of offence to his subjects, how loving to his nobility, and in particular to him. Besides, by the favours of the king, Macbeth stood high in the opinion of all sorts of men, and how would these honours be stained by the suspicion of so foul a murder?
In these conflicts of the mind, Lady Macbeth found her husband resolving to proceed no further with the dreadful deed. But she, being a woman not easily shaken from her evil purpose, began to pour in at his ears words of her own spirit, telling him reason upon reason why he should not shrink from what he had undertaken, how easy the deed was, how soon it would be over, and how the action of one short night would give to all their nights and days to come sovereign sway and royalty. Then she threw contempt on his change of purpose, and accused him of fickleness and of cowardice. Finally, she added how practicable it was to lay the guilt of the deed upon the drunken, sleepy grooms. And with the valour of her tongue, she so chastised his sluggish resolutions that he once more summoned up courage to do the bloody business.
Macbeth, taking the dagger in his hand, softly stole in the dark to the room where Duncan lay, and entering the king's room, he dispatched him with one stroke of the dagger. Just as he had done the murder, one of the grooms, who slept in the chamber, cried, "Murder!" which woke them both. But they said a short prayer and returned to sleep. Then Macbeth thought he heard a voice which cried, "Sleep no more. Macbeth doth murder sleep." And again it cried, "Sleep no more. Glamis hath murdered sleep, and therefore Cawdor shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more."
With such horrible imaginations, Macbeth returned to his wife, who had begun to think he had failed in his purpose. He came in so distracted a state that she reproached him for his want of firmness, and sent him to wash his hands of the blood which stained them, while she took his dagger to stain the cheeks of the grooms with blood and make it seem their guilt. Morning came, and with it the discovery of the murder, and though Macbeth and his lady made great show of grief, and the proofs against the grooms were sufficiently strong, yet the entire suspicion fell upon Macbeth, and Duncan's 2 sons fled. Malcolm, the eldest, sought for refuge in the English court, and the youngest, Donalbain, made his escape to Ireland. With the king's sons gone, Macbeth, as next heir, was crowned king. Thus the third prediction of the Weird Sisters was accomplished.
Though placed so high, Macbeth and his queen could not forget the prophecy of the witches, that although Macbeth should be king, yet it was the heirs of Banquo that should be kings after him. The thought of this, and that they had defiled their hands with blood and done so great a crime, so rankled with them, that they determined to put to death both Banquo and his son. For this purpose they made a great supper, to which they invited all the thanes, and among the rest, Banquo and his son Fleance were invited as chief guests. But on the journey to the palace, Banquo and Fleance were beset by murderers appointed by Macbeth. Banquo was stabbed and killed. However, in the scuffle, Fleance escaped and made his way to England.
At supper that night, the Queen played the hostess with a gracefulness and attention to everyone present. Macbeth discoursed freely with his thanes and nobles, saying that all that was honourable in the country was under his roof, if he had but his good friend Banquo present. Just at these words, the ghost of Banquo, whom he had caused to be murdered, entered the room, and placed himself on the chair which Macbeth was about to occupy. Although Macbeth was a bold man, at this horrible sight his cheeks turned white with fear, and he stood quite unmanned with his eyes fixed upon the ghost. His queen and all the nobles, who saw nothing but an empty chair, took it for a fit of distraction, and she reproached him for his strange behaviour. But Macbeth continued to see the ghost, and addressed it with distracted words, yet so significant that his queen, fearing their dreadful secret would be disclosed, in great haste dismissed the guests, excusing the infirmity of Macbeth as a disorder he was often troubled with.
After this, Macbeth and his queen had their sleep afflicted with terrible dreams. But the blood of Banquo troubled them less than the escape of Fleance, whom now they looked upon as father to a line of kings. With these miserable thoughts they found no peace, and Macbeth determined to seek out the weird sisters and know from them the worst. He found them in a cave upon the heath, where they were engaged in preparing their dreadful charms, by which they conjured up infernal spirits to reveal to them the future. Their horrid ingredients included toads, bats, and serpents, the eye of a newt and the tongue of a dog, the leg of a lizard, and the wing of the night owl, the scale of a dragon, the tooth of a wolf, the root of poisonous hemlock, and the twigs of the yew tree that roots itself in graves. All these were set to boil in a great cauldron.
The weird sisters then called forth the spirits, which were 3. And the first arose in the likeness of an armed head, and he called Macbeth by name, and bid him beware of Macduff, the Thane of Fife, for which caution Macbeth thanked him, for he had long entertained a jealous disliking of Macduff. The second spirit arose in the likeness of a child, and he called Macbeth by name, and bid him have no fear, for none born naturally of a woman would have power to hurt him, and he advised him to be bloody, bold, and resolute. The last spirit arose in the form of a child, crowned with a tree in his hand. He again called Macbeth by name, and told him he should never be vanquished until the woods of Burnham should come against to fight him. This comforted Macbeth, who cried,
"Sweet forebodings! Good! Who can unfix a forest and move it from its earthbound roots? I see I shall live the usual period of a man's life, and not be cut off by a violent death. But my heart longs to know one thing. Tell me, if your art can tell so much, if Banquo's issue shall ever reign in this kingdom."
Here the cauldron sank into the ground, and a noise of music was heard, and 8 shadows like kings passed by Macbeth, and Banquo last, who smiled upon Macbeth and pointed to the shadows, by which Macbeth knew that these were the posterity of Banquo, who should reign after him in Scotland. And the witches, with a sound of soft music and with dancing, vanished.
From this time the thoughts of Macbeth were all bloody and dreadful. The first thing he heard when he left the witches' cave was that Macduff, Thane of Fife, had fled to England to join the army which was forming against him under Malcolm, with the intention to displace Macbeth and set Malcolm, the rightful heir, upon the throne. Macbeth, stung with rage, set upon the castle of Macduff, and put his wife and children to the sword, and slaughtered them all. These, and such like deeds, alienated the minds of all his chief nobility from him. Such as could fled to join the army in England. Everybody hated the tyrant. Nobody loved or honoured him, but all suspected him. And he began to envy the condition of Duncan, whom he had murdered, who slept soundly in his grave with nothing and no one to hurt him any longer.
While these things were happening, the Queen, who had been the sole partner in his wickedness, was afflicted by terrible nightly dreams which caused her to walk in her sleep. Finally she died, it is supposed by her own hands, unable to bear any longer the remorse of guilt and public hate. This event left Macbeth alone, without a soul to love or care for him, or a friend to whom he could confide his wicked purposes. He grew careless of life, and wished for death, but the approach of Malcolm's army roused in him what remained of his ancient courage, and he determined to die fighting. Besides this, the hollow promises of the witches had filled him with a false confidence. Had they not said that none born naturally of a woman should hurt him? Nor could he be vanquished until Burnham Wood should come to Dunsinane, which surely could never be. So he shut himself up in his castle and awaited the approach of Malcolm.
Then came the dreadful day when a messenger came to him, pale and shaking with fear, and told Macbeth that as he stood upon his watch on the hill, he looked towards Burnham, and it seemed to him that the woods had begun to move. "Liar and slave!" cried Macbeth. If thou speakest false, thou shalt hang alive upon the next tree till famine end thee. But Macbeth now began to lose his resolution. He had been told that he was not to fear till Birnam Woods should come to Dunsinane, and now the woods were moving. How could this be?
This idea of the woods moving is easily solved. When the approaching army marched through the woods of Birnam, Malcolm, like a skilful general, instructed his soldiers to hew down branches and carry them in front of them, by way of concealing the true number of his army. Now a severe battle took place, in which Macbeth fought with extreme rage and valour, cutting to pieces all who were opposed to him, till he, at last, came to where Macduff was fighting. Seeing Macduff, and remembering the caution of the spirit who had counselled him to avoid Macduff above all men, he would have turned, but Macduff opposed his turning, wishing to wreak revenge for the foul murder of his wife and children.
Desperate now, Macbeth remembered the words of the spirit, that no one, except one who was unnaturally born, could harm him, and he told this to Macduff, saying he bore a charmed life. At this Macduff cried, "Despair thy charm, and let that lying spirit whom thou hast served tell thee that Macduff was never naturally born of a woman, but was taken violently from his mother before her time." "Accursed be the tongue which tells me so," said the trembling Macbeth, as all his confidence left him. "I will not fight with thee." "Then live," said the scornful Macduff, "and we will make a show of thee, as men show monsters, and a painted board on which shall be written, 'Here men may see the tyrant.'" At this Macbeth's courage returned, and he cried out, "Never! I will not live to kiss the ground before young Malcolm's feet, and to be baited with the curses of the rabble. Though the spirit's curses have come to pass, yet will I fight to the last."
With these frantic words he threw himself upon Macduff, who, after a severe struggle, overcame him, and, cutting off his head, made a present of it to the young and lawful king, Malcolm. This king now took upon him the government of which he had been deprived so long, and he ascended the throne of his father Duncan, amid the rejoicing and acclamations of the nobles and the people.